Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 3, and our text is from Joshua chapter 7, God judging the disobedience of Achan, reworking that title into the serpent being from the garden, enticing Achan. So, what we're going to see are some allusions to stories that happened previously in the scriptures, all the way back to Genesis 3, of course, with the serpent in the garden, and then a little bit baked in from Numbers chapter 13 and 14 when Moses sends out the spies to spy out the land, and they bring back the report they do, which ultimately leads to the rejection of that generation and their consignment to the wilderness for 40 years. So in verse 2 of chapter 7, we see that Joshua sends men from Jericho to Ai. So, of course, this is repetitive of what Joshua has done. He's already sent spies to Jericho, but this actually alludes back to the moment in Numbers chapter 14 when Moses set the precedent as the Lord had commanded him to send spies to go out into the land. So it's a reconnaissance mission as it was before, of course. And when they come back, they actually have instruction, some practical advice for what should be a better campaign against Ai since it's smaller than Jericho is. Now, in these blue blocks here, I'm actually alluding back to other places that surround the events of what's going on here. So Genesis chapter 2 and 3, but some of this also from Joshua chapter 6 and 7, because here we have some direct quotations of what's going on that helps or direct quotations from certain characters that helps clue us into a little bit more of what's playing out in the dynamic here. So, back in Genesis chapter 2, the Lord gave an explicit command to them of not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if they do, they will die. Now, Joshua has given instruction as well, because this is what the Lord has told him to tell the people. In Joshua chapter 6, they are to keep themselves set apart because Jericho, all of Jericho, is set apart for destruction. If they take anything that is set apart for the Lord and is to be given completely over to Him as an offering, then they will become forfeit and be set aside for destruction. All right, so that's the command that's given both to Adam and Eve, and the command that Achan, along with all the rest of the Israelite warriors, hears. So in verse 1 of chapter 7, this is what we are told, that Achan took some of what was set apart, and the Lord's anger burned. So notice here the hyperlink back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6 when Eve has dialogued with the serpent being, and here she took some of its fruit and ate it. So, of course, a native Hebrew speaker and reader would read the word in Hebrew and be able to make the connection back to the original text, as the story itself is highly stylized, such that Achan looking at what was set apart and then succumbing to the temptation to take what he was forbidden to is a direct connection back to what the first pair of human beings in the garden did. And remember, this whole motif of Israel being a corporate Adam and now entering into their provincial Eden to eradicate all of the wild olives that have grown there, i.e., the Canaanite tribes, so that they, as the select olive branch that was plucked up out of Egypt, can be planted there to then grow, overgrow the garden, tentacle out to the nations, and bring blessing to them. We go back to Genesis 3 and verse 6. The woman saw that the tree was good, so she took some of its fruit. What was good in her own eyes is what she wound up succumbing to. And then in verse 21 of Joshua 7, we hear the words from Achan himself that when I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak, I coveted to them and I took them. So as the woman saw, so does Achan. Then we go a little further down. So of course, we already have heard Achan witness or bear witness to what it was he's done, but backing up just a little bit here in verse 7, we have Joshua still playing out the process of the discovery of trying to figure out why this defeat at Ai took place. So in verse 7, this is what we hear him saying as he's now crying out to the Lord, why did you, the pronoun here directly addresses Yahweh, bring these people across the Jordan Valley for our destruction? Now, this is where the influence from Numbers chapter 13 and 14 comes in, because this is exactly what happens when the people respond to the words of what the 12 spies bring out, which is all the more ironic considering Joshua is part of that group. Now, it would be great if we had some privy to the dialogue that happened amongst these 12 spies. Were these 10 already talking amongst themselves as to what kind of report they were going to give? Or were Joshua and Caleb completely dumbfounded to hear their 10 brother Israelites say to these people, we're like grasshoppers and we're just going to be squished? But whether that happened or did not, with respect to a work up to the speech that was going to be given. Clearly, they heard the words delivered and then worked furiously to try to countermand them. But here, Joshua is the one now lending his voice, like these Israelites did in verse 3 of Numbers 14. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land so that we will die by the sword? And this, in and of itself, is kind of a callback to what the serpent being said in Genesis chapter 3, when he directly contradicts what Yahweh said. He says, no, you will not certainly die. Now, death is not what's all the only thing that's connecting these passages together, but working from Genesis 3, the serpent being is saying to the original image bearers, what Yahweh said is not true. You won't die, something else will happen to you. Now, clearly, Joshua understands as much as one could from what happened in the aftermath of Numbers chapter 14 that death is certainly what Yahweh granted to that previous generation, and he is alive simply because God promised that he and Caleb would be the sole survivors of that generation to enter into the land. So now Joshua has the promise of what Moses came and brought to them while they were still alive and living in Egypt. And then, of course, the promise he's heard over the last 40 years from the time that they rejected the entrance into the land. And now he's heard yet again from Yahweh that he will be with him. And Joshua is calling that into question here, like the serpent being did. And of course, like these people of Israel did in Numbers 14, when they asked why Yahweh has brought them to this particular brink in the journey, just for them to perish by the sword. Because when we go back to Genesis 2:17, Yahweh did indeed say, you will certainly die in the day that you eat of that fruit. And there's no exception clause to that. Much like in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 8, when the Lord appears to Moses and speaks to him, he tells him, I've come down to bring them to a good and a spacious land. But this is all predicated upon the promises already made to Abraham, which we would have every reason to presume Israel has a working knowledge of and memory of. And now the promise demonstrated by the signs that Moses has entered into Egypt with, that Yahweh is with him. He's called him and brought him into the land for this reason. Everything that happened with the plagues, crossing of the Red Sea, their divine preservation in the wilderness, and they're battling with people like Amalek and then the Canaanite king of Arad and so forth. They know the Lord is with them. Why would Joshua say this thing? But of course, he doesn't understand why what should have been an easy victory was actually forfeited in a rather senseless defeat. So it brings us to the last yellow block, that Joshua brought them, that is Achan and his family, to the valley of Achor, and all Israel stoned them to death. Clearly, this is a measure of permanence here, because once they're dead, they're dead. There is no bringing them back. And the entire family, including their livestock, had to suffer this, which of course raises questions as to why such severity with respect to why Achan and his entire family being punished. Why could Achan not just answer for his crimes? Why does his entire family have to suffer in this way? But one could easily ask the same question with respect to what happened here in Genesis chapter 3. It was an act of disobedience and willful with that, but at the same time, it wasn't as though Adam had committed the crime of his son Cain in murdering his brother Abel or something like that. Why was it that just in taking something that they were forbidden from taking, does God answer with this kind of force and verb? But the reason is because they are being made an example of. Adam, the federal head of all humanity, and Achan, the first person who, after crossing the Jordan, does something that willfully violates the Lord's command, to which was attached a clear punishment that no exception or caveat was given to. If you take what is set apart, then you set yourself apart for destruction, and Achan cannot claim willful ignorance. Much in the same way that that generation within the wilderness, of which the 10 paired up with Joshua and Caleb gave this negative report, those men who spread that report, the Lord struck them down immediately. They didn't wander a single day beyond that in the wilderness. They died immediately. God made an example of them as well. So I think it's very important for us to work through this concept as teachers with our students, the connections between at least this story and the Genesis 3 story, whether you overlay it with Numbers 13 or not, but helping make better sense of Joshua's statement about why has the Lord led us here for destruction, I think would bring another level of meaning to it. And then, of course, we'll unpack this more in the weeks to come when we get into our 30-minute workshop. So thanks for listening. Tune in for the next session.